Free speech isn't something which is just one of a set of things you can pick and choose from. It is the absolutely central right upon which every other right is based. And that awareness of that, it strikes me, is disappearing all the time. Its absolute centrality, I would say, is being demonstrated day in and day out at the moment. And let me give you an example of that. The migration crisis through which Europe is going at the moment has been made infinitely worse at absolutely every step of the way by our inability to understand the importance of free speech. Absolutely every step of that journey. It's my belief that when the speech goes wrong, the ideas go wrong, and when the ideas go wrong, the politics goes wrong. And our politics has gone so very wrong in recent years because the speech has gone wrong, because the ideas have gone wrong. Let me give you a couple of examples. In September last year, at the height of the crisis that she herself had created, Chancellor Merkel sat at a lunch at the UN in New York and was sitting next to Mark Zuckerberg of Facebook. And Chancellor Merkel, unfortunately, as can happen to anybody, had an open mic. Her mic was still on, or there was a mic on the table that was on, and it picked up about 30 seconds of the conversation between her and Mark Zuckerberg, which they had thought was private. And in it, Chancellor Merkel opens by saying to Mark Zuckerberg, "What can you do to stop people writing anti-migration stuff on Facebook?" And his reply was, "We're working on it." Now, absolutely everything, in my view, that has gone wrong in Europe in recent years can be traced back to that exchange. It epitomizes the problem. Chancellor Merkel, by the way, doesn't just try to stop criticism of herself. She tried to stop through Facebook the dissemination of almost any view of the migration crisis that was not entirely supportive of her point of view. And when I say that when the speech goes wrong, the politics goes wrong, here are just a few examples of how that happens. George Orwell said, it's one of the quotes that was on the handout for this conference, famously said that if liberty means anything at all, it means the right to tell people what they do not want to hear. So let me divide this into two different sections. Firstly, what Chancellor Merkel and other politicians across our continent, and particularly I would say the Swedish government, did not want people to hear. They did not want to hear that letting in millions of people into Europe in the space of months would massively destabilize European society for our long-term future. They didn't want to hear it. They wanted to believe that societies, cultures like ours, are such enormously powerful things that you could allow in millions of people from totally different cultures and that they would get with the program on the second or so day they arrived. I don't see cultures like that, by the way. I see them more as kind of fragile ecosystems, which take years and years to grow up, decades and centuries to develop, and which can be destroyed in the space of a lifetime. Chancellor Merkel and her colleagues took a different view. But by shutting down the debate, at no point did they allow themselves access to the questions that they should have been asking. And the remarkable thing about this is that only 5 years before she made that catastrophic, to my mind, decision, Chancellor Merkel gave one of her most famous speeches in which she said that multiculturalism had failed. What did she mean by that? She said it herself. She said, at the beginning of the speech, she said, we had assumed that the guest workers would go home. To my mind, this is a demonstration of every single thing in the post-war migration period in Europe having been woefully misunderstood. At no stage did any of our politicians ever anticipate the things that would happen next. At no stage. People thought that the people who came in would leave. People thought they wouldn't come in such large numbers. People thought they would come in such large numbers, but then they would integrate. People then thought maybe they shouldn't integrate. Some people said you should integrate, and their colleagues said no, that's colonialist thinking, and so on. So we were confused throughout this whole episode, and we were partly confused because we deliberately stopped ourselves from having the discussion. That we will end up having to have at some point anyway. Let me give you one quick example. It's been obvious to me for a long time that if you say that if you open the borders, as Chancellor Merkel did last year, you have an absolute horde of questions that follow on next. It would seem to me that the most obvious question to ask is Europe a place in which anyone in the world who wants a better life can legitimately come and live? That's the beginning of a question to ask. The current thinking, it seems, is to stem the flow at the time being, but we still haven't addressed any of the fundamental questions. The current discussion about this has reduced to the discussion of legitimate asylum seekers and economic migrants. Let's say that the Vice Commissioner of the European Commission, Frans Timmermans, was right earlier this year when he said in his estimate at least 60% of the people who arrived into Europe in 2015 had no more right to be in Europe than anybody else in the world. Let's say that's right. Let's say that there are going to be consequences from that. Let's say that Germany is therefore going to deport 750,000 people who arrived last year. Let's say that Sweden is going to, as one of your government ministers pretended, deport 80,000 of the people who arrived last year. None of this is going to happen. It's an absolute lie, and they must know it as they say it. They must know it. There is no way on earth that they have the provision or the political will to carry out such an act.